A retired police K9 officer opened his door before dawn and found the same German Shepherd puppy still waiting in the cold. For 3 nights, she had stayed near the porch because the old retired K9 she followed home was sleeping inside. When Gavin carried her in, the puppy reached past him for Maren. Then came the surprise. She was not abandoned. She already had a loving family searching for her. But even after going home, she kept watching the door and trying to return to the one dog who made her feel safe. Soon, 2 loving homes faced the same painful question. What does it really mean to do what is best for her? Share your own touching animal story, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Late October had stripped most of the color from the trees around the northern Michigan town where Gavin Rourke lived. What remained clung stubbornly to the maples, rust-colored leaves trembling against a sky the color of brushed steel. At 49, Gavin had learned to appreciate seasons that did not ask much of him. He had spent nearly 2 decades working police K9 assignments, first as a patrol officer who happened to understand dogs better than most people, then as a handler whose days could change direction with one radio call. Retirement had removed the radio, the uniform, and most of the urgency. What it had not removed was the habit of noticing things. The loose hinge on a neighbor's gate. A vehicle parked somewhere it normally wasn't. The exact moment Maren stopped listening to him and began listening to something else. Maren was 9 now, a dark sable German Shepherd with silver beginning to soften the fur around her muzzle. The tip of her right ear bent slightly outward, an old injury that had never affected her hearing. Her deep brown eyes remained steady and unreadable in the way Gavin remembered from their working years. Age showed more clearly elsewhere. Cold mornings made her left rear leg stiff. That morning, when she rose from the rug beside the kitchen, the first 3 steps were careful. Gavin waited without commenting. By the time Maren reached the back door, her stride had loosened. "You ready?" Maren looked at him. That was enough. Their afternoon walk followed the same residential loop they had used for years. Gavin wore his faded navy chore jacket over a gray Henley, hands resting loosely in the pockets as Maren moved beside him on a simple lead. She no longer wore the black working harness that had once announced what she was before people even saw the badge beside her. These days, she was simply an old dog walking home. They were 3 blocks from the house when Maren slowed. Gavin took another step before feeling the leash change. He stopped. Maren had turned her head toward the road behind them. At first, Gavin saw nothing unusual. 2 parked trucks, a mailbox leaning slightly toward the ditch, leaves tumbling over the pavement. Then something moved beside a cedar hedge. A puppy stepped into view. German Shepherd. Young. Very young. Gavin guessed 8 weeks, perhaps a little older. The puppy was small enough that the paws looked unfinished on the rest of the body. Warm sable gold fur covered most of the coat, with darker shading beginning along the spine. The left ear had started to rise while the right still tipped sideways. No collar. A little too thin. And staring directly at Maren. "Well," Gavin murmured. "Where did you come from?" The puppy did not look at him. Gavin crouched several yards away and turned slightly sideways, avoiding the direct posture that frightened uncertain dogs. He held one hand low. Nothing. The puppy's eyes stayed on Maren. Maren looked back with considerably less interest. Gavin stood and walked another 10 yards. Tiny paws followed. He stopped. The puppy stopped. He changed sides of the road. The puppy changed sides too. By the time Gavin reached the entrance to his property, he had checked every visible porch and driveway for someone calling after a missing dog. No one came. Maren passed through the backyard gate. Gavin stepped inside and waited. The puppy stopped beyond the opening. For several seconds, the 3 of them remained there. Gavin inside the fence, Maren beside him, the puppy on the other side, as if an invisible line had been drawn in the dirt. Gavin opened the gate wider. "Your decision." The puppy darted through. Not toward Gavin. Straight toward Maren. She shoved her small head beneath Maren's neck with such confidence that Gavin nearly laughed. Maren did not. The retired K9 stepped sideways, freeing herself with one deliberate movement. The puppy followed. Maren moved again. The puppy followed again. "You've made a friend," Gavin said. Maren gave him a look that suggested he had misunderstood the situation. Near the maple tree, she found the old black rubber ball she had carried around for years. She picked it up. The puppy immediately tried to take it. Marin raised her head. The puppy stretched higher. Marin walked away. The puppy bounced after her and made a second attempt, this time bumping Marin's shoulder. A low warning came from the older dog's chest. The puppy froze. The ball dropped from Marin's mouth. For a heartbeat, Gavin expected the puppy to retreat. Instead, she sat. Her right ear remained tilted sideways. Her tail rested against the grass. Marin looked at her for another second, picked up the ball, and continued walking. The puppy rose and followed at a more respectful distance. Gavin smiled despite himself. Whatever else she was, she learned quickly. He spent the next hour pretending to work on a loose porch board while watching the yard more closely than the board deserved. The puppy explored only when Marin explored. When Marin stopped, the puppy stopped. When Marin drank from the outdoor bowl, the puppy waited until she moved away before approaching. Once, Marin crossed behind the shed and disappeared from sight. The puppy abandoned a leaf she had been attacking and ran after her immediately. That caught Gavin's attention, not the running. The urgency. The puppy emerged again only after Marin did. Gavin sat back on his heels. A stray puppy might follow another dog. A frightened puppy might follow a person. But this felt narrower than either of those explanations. The little dog was not searching the yard. She was keeping track of one specific animal inside it. By 5:30, the light had thinned and the temperature was dropping. Gavin stood at the kitchen door. Marin. The old shepherd climbed the porch steps and walked inside. The puppy followed her. 1 step. 2. Then stopped. Her front paws reached the edge of the threshold. Marin was already several feet into the kitchen. The puppy stretched her neck forward. Come on, Gavin said quietly. He moved away from the entrance to give her space. Nothing. The screen door shifted in a gust of wind. Its lower edge scraped softly against the frame. The puppy jumped backward so quickly that her rear paws slipped on the porch boards. Gavin stopped moving. The puppy stared at the doorway. Marin turned from inside the kitchen. For several seconds, the puppy seemed caught between two things she could not reconcile. Whatever frightened her about crossing that threshold, and the fact that Marin was now on the other side of it. Gavin did not reach for her. Years working dogs had taught him that forcing an animal through fear rarely erased the fear. More often it simply taught the animal that fear came with losing control. So he left the door open. He sat at the kitchen table where she could see him. Marin lay several feet inside. 10 minutes passed. The puppy never crossed. Eventually Gavin closed the door. Then he began making calls. He photographed the puppy through the porch window and sent the image to the county animal control office. Their evening staff was already handling 2 calls farther north and could not come immediately. He contacted the nearest shelter. No matching report. Then he called the veterinary clinic that had treated Marin since retirement and left the same description. Female German Shepherd puppy. Approximately 8 weeks. No visible collar. Found near the east residential loop. By the time he finished, darkness had settled over the yard. Gavin carried a shallow water bowl outside, followed by a small portion of food. The puppy waited until he backed away before eating. He could have caught her. He knew exactly how. That was not the same as believing he should. Instead, he converted the most sheltered corner of the covered porch into something safer for the night. A thick foam pad went down first, raised from the cold boards. Over it he folded 2 dry towels and an old fleece blanket. The porch walls blocked most of the west wind, and the roof extended far enough to keep the bedding dry unless the weather changed direction. The puppy sniffed the arrangement suspiciously. Marin watched through the glass. Finally, the puppy circled twice and lay down. Gavin checked her before bed. Then again shortly after midnight. The temperature remained above freezing. The bedding was dry. The puppy lifted her head when he opened the inner door, but made no attempt to leave. At 6 the next morning, Gavin found her sitting beside the steps. The instant Marin appeared, the small tail began hammering the porch. Gavin looked beyond the fence. No owner. No car slowing at the curb. No voice calling from down the road. He told himself someone would come. People lost puppies. People searched the wrong streets. A photograph might take a day to reach the right person. So he repeated the calls, refreshed the local lost animal listings, and kept the puppy fed while refusing to decide that her presence meant she belonged to him. The second day passed much like the first. Marin tolerated her. Barely. The puppy attempted the rubber ball again. She received nothing. She considered Marin's tail, remembered yesterday's warning, and changed direction before touching it. Gavin actually laughed at that. Progress. Marin remained unconvinced. That evening, the puppy again stopped at the threshold. This time Gavin propped the screen door fully open. He placed food several feet inside. The puppy leaned forward until one paw hovered over the indoor mat. Then she withdrew. Gavin replaced the outdoor bedding with fresh, dry material and added another insulating layer beneath it. He checked the forecast twice. Cold, but manageable beneath shelter. He checked the puppy 3 times during the night. Each time she was still there. By the third evening, Gavin's confidence in his explanation had begun to thin. There had been no call. No response to the shelter notice. No one had driven slowly past the property searching the yards. And still the puppy remained. The weather changed after dark. A damp northeast wind arrived first, pushing mist beneath the outer edge of the porch. Gavin moved the bedding farther inward and replaced one towel after noticing moisture along a corner. The puppy watched every movement. Marin stood behind the kitchen glass. When Gavin finally went inside, the little dog settled where she could still see the dark shape of the older shepherd through the door. Near midnight, rain began tapping against the roof. Gavin woke once and checked again. The puppy was curled tightly but sheltered. He returned to bed without turning on the hallway light. Somewhere nearby, he kept telling himself, there had to be a family searching for her. She was simply waiting until they found the right house. Before dawn, Gavin woke to the sound of nails against the bedroom floor. Marin stood beside the bed. She did not bark. She looked at him once, turned, and walked into the hallway. Marin. She continued toward the kitchen. Gavin pulled on his jeans and followed. The house was dark except for the pale clock above the stove. Marin stopped at the back door. Gavin looked through the glass. Rain shone faintly across the porch boards. And in the sheltered corner, small and tightly curled against the bedding, the puppy was still there. Gavin opened the back door carefully. The rain had weakened to a fine mist, but the air still carried the damp cold that had arrived during the night. Marin stepped onto the porch first and stopped several feet from the sheltered corner. The puppy did not rise. That was what changed everything. For 3 days, the smallest movement from Marin had been enough to bring the puppy to her feet. Now she remained curled tightly on the foam pad, nose tucked toward her chest, the edge of the fleece blanket damp where the wind had pushed moisture beneath the roof. Gavin crouched beside her. Hey, little one. One eye opened. Then the other. A faint tremor moved beneath the sable gold coat. Gavin pressed 2 fingers gently against her side. The puppy felt colder than she should have. Not rigid, not unresponsive, but cold enough to erase every explanation he had been giving himself since the first evening. He slipped one hand beneath her chest and the other beneath her hindquarters. The puppy gave a small movement when he lifted her. Gavin expected instinct to do the obvious thing. Warm body, warm jacket, shelter. He expected her to curl inward against him. Instead, her head lifted over his forearm. She looked past him, toward Marin. The old shepherd had remained near the door. The puppy stretched toward her. You're kidding me, Gavin whispered. Marin stepped closer. Gavin lowered the puppy just enough for them to meet. Immediately, the little dog pushed her face beneath Marin's chest and pressed herself into the older dog's front legs. Marin stiffened. For a second, Gavin expected her to step away, as she had done whenever the puppy became too intrusive during the previous days. She didn't. She stood there. The trembling beneath Gavin's hands began to slow. Not stop entirely, but slow. He looked from the puppy to Marin, then across the porch. Something about the scene bothered him. Gavin carried the puppy inside and placed her temporarily on a dry towel near the kitchen heater. Marin followed without being called. Then Gavin went back outside. Rain had softened the dirt enough to preserve marks. There were paw prints around the water bowl, more beside the porch steps. A scattered set near the maple where the puppy had followed Marin during the day. Gavin walked toward the gate. He expected to find what he had assumed was there all along, a trail leading outward, some evidence that the puppy had been leaving after dark and returning before morning. There wasn't one. He checked the side yard, then the narrow strip beside the shed. Nothing. The freshest small track stayed inside his property. He returned to the porch and stood beneath the roof. For 2 mornings, he had seen the puppy waiting here and imagined a whole story between one evening and the next. A nearby house. Someone feeding her. A familiar route through the neighborhood. A puppy slipping away at sunrise because another dog had become interesting. He had built that explanation because it was ordinary. The yard told him something else. She had not been coming back. She had been staying. For 3 nights, the puppy had moved between the water bowl, the sheltered bedding, and the door where Maren disappeared each evening. Gavin stared through the kitchen glass. The puppy was lying on the towel now. Maren stood beside her. 3 nights. A sour weight settled in Gavin's stomach. He had checked the weather. He had replaced the bedding. He had kept her fed and sheltered. He had also been wrong. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Years of handling working dogs had taught him to distrust certainty built on incomplete information. Yet somewhere along the way, he had decided the puppy must be leaving because that was the version that made sense. Gavin went inside and closed the door behind him. This time the puppy crossed the threshold in his arms. He did not put her back near it. He moved the foam dog bed from the living room into the kitchen, layered dry towels across it, and positioned it several feet from the heater rather than directly in front of the vent. Then he called Laurel Ames. The veterinary clinic opened at 7:30. Laurel answered before the second ring. "You sound awake," Gavin said. "I've owned a clinic for 14 years. I haven't been asleep since 2012. Despite himself, Gavin smiled. Then he told her what had happened. The humor left her voice immediately. "Warm her gradually. Small amount of water. Don't give her a full meal yet. Bring her when I open." Gavin looked down. The puppy had pushed herself against Maren's front leg, already planning on it. He heated a towel in the dryer and wrapped it loosely around the puppy's body. She accepted a little water from a shallow dish, then several bites of softened food. Maren moved toward the hallway. The puppy's head came up. Maren took another step. The puppy struggled to stand. "Stay down," Gavin murmured. The words meant nothing to her. She tried anyway. Maren looked back. Then, unexpectedly, the older shepherd returned and lowered herself beside the bed. The puppy settled almost at once. Gavin noticed that. He noticed it enough that he did not tell himself what it meant. Not yet. An hour later, the 3 of them were at the clinic. Dr. Laurel Ames met them in an examination room before the waiting area had properly filled. At 44, Laurel had a composed, economical way of moving that Gavin trusted more than reassurance. Her dark hair, cut in a chin-length bob, showed the first streaks of silver at the temples. Steel blue scrubs and a burgundy tube stethoscope made her look exactly as she usually did, prepared, practical, and unimpressed by unnecessary drama. She examined the puppy slowly. Temperature. Gums. Heart. Lungs. Paws. Eyes. Ears. Hydration. Gavin stood against the wall while Maren waited near his boots. "She's cold-stressed," Laurel said eventually. "But you got her warmed before this became something worse." Gavin folded his arms. Meaning she's lucky that porch was covered and raised, and lucky somebody kept replacing dry bedding. He heard the part she did not say. Lucky the weather had not been worse. Laurel continued. "Mild dehydration. A little underweight. Some superficial abrasions on the paw pads. Nothing that worries me by itself." She ran the microchip scanner slowly along the puppy's shoulders and back. No sound. She tried again. Nothing. No chip. No collar either. "I saw your notice." Laurel looked at the puppy, who was now watching 2 sparrows hop along the outside window ledge. One bird fluttered upward. The puppy's head tilted. The second hopped in the opposite direction. Her head tilted the other way. For the first time that morning, Gavin saw something uncomplicated in her. Just a puppy watching birds. "Birdie," he said quietly. Laurel glanced at him. "That's a name." "No." It sounded suspiciously like one. Temporary. Of course. Gavin ignored the smile in her voice. Laurel finished entering the examination notes. Keep her inside while we look for whoever owns her. Small meals today. Plenty of water. Keep the paws clean. And Gavin. He looked over. Don't decide what her behavior means yet. He knew exactly what she was referring to. I haven't. You've been standing there thinking for 15 minutes. Occupational problem. Then let someone else solve this one with you. That stayed with him on the drive home. Not because Laurel had suggested anything dramatic. Because she had reminded him that observation and explanation were different things. Back at the house, Birdie proved considerably healthier once warmth and food had done their work. By afternoon, she had discovered that Gavin's left slipper could be moved. Not easily, but moved. He found her reversing across the kitchen floor with the heel clamped in her mouth, paws sliding while she dragged it beneath the table. You have access to 3 actual toys. Birdie continued pulling. Marin watched from the rug with an expression Gavin chose to interpret as judgment. The puppy dropped the slipper and hurried toward her. Marin stood. Birdie followed. Marin crossed into the living room. Birdie followed. Later, Gavin took Marin outside alone for less than a minute. Birdie waited at the kitchen door until Marin returned. She did not scratch or cry. She simply remained there, completely still, as though nothing else in the house mattered until the old dog came back into view. Over the next 2 days, the pattern became impossible to dismiss. Birdie accepted Gavin. She took food from his hand. She allowed him to inspect her paws without resistance. She fell asleep near his chair one afternoon. But Marin remained the center around which everything else seemed to organize itself. When Marin moved more slowly in the yard, Birdie adjusted without being taught. When Marin stopped, Birdie stopped. When Marin disappeared behind the shed, Birdie abandoned whatever she was doing and followed. Then, one evening, Gavin saw something that changed the question entirely. Marin was lying on the living room rug. Birdie approached and tucked herself along the older dog's side. That alone had become normal. Then the puppy lifted both front paws against Marin's belly. She pressed them alternately into the fur. Once. Twice. Again. Her nose pushed beneath the longer hair along Marin's underside, searching with a blind familiarity that seemed older than conscious memory. Marin rose immediately, not angrily, simply refusing. Birdie rolled slightly onto one side as the support beneath her disappeared. For several seconds she stayed there. She did not chase. She did not play. She only watched Marin walk away. Something in Gavin's chest tightened. Then Birdie got up and followed. He remained in his chair. Now he understood why the 3 nights on the porch disturbed him so deeply. The puppy had not merely wanted to be near another dog. She behaved as though distance itself meant something to her. What? Gavin still did not know. Marin seemed to understand only that she had acquired a shadow. At first she continued setting boundaries. Birdie approached her food bowl once and found Marin standing between her and it. No growl. No raised hackles. Just presence. Birdie backed away. The lesson held. Mostly. But the older dog began changing too. The shifts were easy to miss. Marin no longer crossed the yard at her usual deliberate pace when Birdie followed. She shortened her stride slightly. One afternoon, Birdie became distracted trying to catch a dry maple leaf tumbling over the grass. Marin continued toward the tree, then stopped. She looked back. She waited. Only when Birdie noticed and hurried after her did Marin continue. Gavin saw it from the porch. He said nothing. 2 days later, Marin found her old black rubber ball near the fence. She carried it across the yard. Birdie noticed immediately. Gavin expected another hopeless attempt to steal it. Instead, Marin walked toward the puppy. She dropped the ball directly in front of her. Birdie stared at it. Then at Marin. The ball was nearly too large for her mouth. She tried once, lost it, chased it, trapped it between both front paws, and finally settled on chewing one edge. Marin walked several feet away and lay down. She did not take it back. Gavin stood at the kitchen window longer than necessary. For most of Marin's life, That ball had belonged to a very small category of objects she considered hers. Apparently, the category had changed. That evening, Birdie fell asleep with one paw across the ball. Maren slept nearby, not touching, but closer than before. Gavin's phone rang just after 4 the following afternoon. Laurel's name appeared on the screen. He answered while standing at the kitchen counter. Please tell me somebody called about the puppy. Not exactly. Gavin straightened. Laurel sounded careful now. A rescue coordinator saw the photo and description I circulated. She thinks she recognizes her. Gavin looked across the room. Birdie was asleep on the rug. Maren rested several feet away. How sure? Sure enough that she pulled the foster records. Gavin said nothing. Laurel continued. They know where she came from. That should have been good news. For 3 days, it was exactly what he had been waiting for. Then Laurel added one more thing. Gavin, she wasn't waiting to be adopted. His eyes moved back to the sleeping puppy. She already was. The rescue coordinator arrived just before noon with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a navy clipboard tucked beneath her arm. Tessa Vaughn was 52, compact, quick-moving, and looked like someone who had spent years entering houses where animals, people, or both were already overwhelmed. Short ash-blonde curls framed a round face behind square black glasses. She greeted Gavin at the door, looked once at Maren, once at the puppy sleeping beside the sofa, and lowered her voice automatically. That's her. Gavin stepped aside. You're certain? Certain enough that I brought the file. They sat at the kitchen table while Birdie remained asleep in the living room. Tessa opened the folder. There were 6 puppy intake photographs clipped together. Gavin recognized her immediately. Same uneven ears. Same dark tip on the tail. Same narrow gold marking above the left eye. The puppies in the photograph were crowded together inside a foster pen, some climbing across one another, some barely visible beneath the others. Tessa tapped the smallest female near the back. That's the one you've got. Gavin looked toward the living room. Where did the litter come from? Private surrender through one of our foster partners. 6 puppies. Mother was lost when they were about 5 weeks old. Gavin's attention returned to the page. 5 weeks. Too young to be without her, even if they had survived well physically. Tessa continued before he could build too much meaning around the fact. They stayed together. Bottle support at first, then soft food. Foster volunteers rotated them through homes that had stable adult dogs. She turned another page. Most of it was routine. Weights. Feeding schedules. Vaccination dates. Notes about appetite. Then Gavin saw a handwritten line repeated several times. Settles better beside adult dog. Another entry, several days later. Would not sleep alone. Moved bedding beside older retriever. And another. If no adult dog present, presses between littermates before settling. Gavin read the lines twice. Tessa watched him. Does that sound familiar? A little. Don't turn it into a diagnosis. Gavin glanced up. You and Laurel rehearsed that line? No. People just like simple explanations. She pushed the papers toward him. She lost her mother early. That may matter. Maybe a lot. Maybe less than we think. What we know is that she developed a strong preference for sleeping close to another dog. That's observation. Everything after that is interpretation. Gavin appreciated the distinction. It also made the situation harder. A simple explanation could be solved. A complicated one had to be lived with. He turned another page. A photograph showed the puppy wearing a soft teal collar. Gavin looked at the dog asleep in his living room. Where's that collar? Tessa's expression changed slightly. That's part of the other thing. She pulled a phone from her bag and showed him a photograph sent by the adopters. A narrow strip of teal fabric lay beside a section of wooden fencing. The buckle was missing. It was caught near the bottom of their fence. Soil was loose underneath. Looks like she widened the gap enough to squeeze through and the collar snagged. So she didn't arrive here without one. No. And the chip? Scheduled for her next appointment. She was still technically foster to adopt. Gavin leaned back. That explained 2 things he had quietly disliked about the situation. It did not explain the larger one. How far away? Just under a mile if you cut through the green strip behind the houses. Longer by road. That surprised him. I called county animal control. They called the shelter in their township. Different intake system. They called clinics. Several. Not Laurel's. Tessa gave a tired little shrug. Two people can search very hard and still search on opposite sides of an administrative line. There was no incompetence in it. No negligent owner who had failed to care. Just two sets of people trying to solve the same problem without knowing the other existed. Gavin looked again at the intake photograph. What did they call her? Tessa hesitated. Pippa. From the living room, one small ear lifted. Gavin turned. The puppy did not rise, but the ear remained up. Tessa noticed. She knows it. Gavin stared at her for a moment. Birdie had never been her name. He had known that. Still, hearing the real one somehow shifted her place in the house. She had not arrived from nowhere. She had a history. And somebody had already been saying her name before Gavin ever saw her standing beside the cedar hedge. By 3 that afternoon, a dark SUV turned into his driveway. Gavin watched from the porch. The driver got out first. Graham Bellamy was 47, broad through the chest with the solid build of someone who spent more time around machinery than gyms. He wore a dark forest green work jacket over a steel blue shirt, and his ash-brown hair had begun receding at both temples. His face carried the exhausted restraint of someone trying not to expect good news until good news was standing directly in front of him. The passenger door opened before he reached the front walk. Celeste Bellamy moved faster. She was 45, smaller than Graham, wearing a muted blue cardigan beneath a slate coat. Auburn hair streaked lightly with gray had been tied low at the back of her neck. A small silver locket moved against her sweater as she crossed the porch. Neither asked where the puppy was. Their eyes were already searching. Gavin opened the door. Pippa stood beside Marin in the living room. Celeste stopped. The puppy looked at her. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then Celeste said softly, "Pippa." The puppy's whole body changed. Her head came up. Her tail started moving. Then she ran. She crossed the room so fast that her paws slipped once on the hardwood before she reached Celeste. Celeste dropped to both knees. Pippa pressed into her immediately. Not cautiously. Not like a dog tolerating a stranger. She pushed her nose beneath Celeste's arm, circled, returned, and bounced against her legs with the loose, unguarded excitement Gavin had never seen her show anyone except Marin. Celeste laughed. The sound broke halfway through. There you are. Graham crouched beside them. Pippa turned toward him without hesitation. He rubbed both hands along her shoulders and neck, then stopped as if checking that she was actually real. Gavin watched from several feet away. Something inside him loosened. Whatever story the puppy had brought to his porch, it had not begun with cruelty. She remembered these people. More than that. She trusted them. Graham sat back on one heel. We looked everywhere. I know. We had 3 days with her. Celeste stroked Pippa's ears. 3 days and half the house already belonged to her. Graham managed a small smile. She stole a sock the first night. That sounds accurate, Gavin said. For several minutes the room felt almost simple. They explained the fenced backyard, the puppy bed beside the kitchen, the gate they had installed near the stairs. They had waited weeks for the foster placement to move forward. Celeste had bought a tag, but delayed attaching it until they were sure the collar fit comfortably. Then the gap appeared beneath the fence. By the time Graham found the torn section of collar, Pippa was gone. They searched streets first, then parks, then yards. Celeste posted photographs online. Graham drove after work until darkness made the neighborhood useless to search. Nothing they described sounded careless. Nothing sounded like a place a dog needed to escape. That realization should have answered Gavin's questions. Instead, it created a new one. Marin stood from the rug. She stretched, careful with the left rear leg, and walked toward the kitchen. Pippa noticed instantly. Her tail stopped. Celeste was still touching her shoulder when the puppy turned away. Then Pippa followed Marin out of the room. Graham watched her disappear. That the dog she followed here? Yes. How long has she been doing that? Since she arrived. Celeste looked toward the kitchen doorway. Everywhere. Pretty much. Silence settled for a moment. Then Celeste asked, "Can we see something?" Gavin understood before she finished. He did not like testing animals for emotional spectacle, but this was different. They were trying to understand a pattern that would matter once Pippa went home. 1 minute, he said. No more. He called Marin. The old shepherd followed him into the small office beside the hallway. Gavin stepped back out and closed the door. Pippa remained where Marin had disappeared. At first, she only stared. Celeste called her. Pippa. The puppy glanced back. She did not move toward her. Her nose returned to the lower edge of the door. 10 seconds. 20. Pippa stepped away, circled once, then returned. By 30 seconds, she had begun moving between the closed door and the center of the hallway. A faint, uncertain sound escaped her. Celeste's expression changed. Not hurt. Concerned. Pippa placed one paw against the door, then another. Gavin opened it. Marin walked out. Pippa rushed forward and pressed herself beneath Marin's chest. This time Gavin did not need to interpret the behavior. The room had seen it together. Graham stood slowly. She's happy to see us. She is, Gavin said. And she's doing that. Yes. Graham looked at Pippa for a long moment. Then he said the thing Gavin had been waiting for. We still want to take her home. There was no aggression in the words. No defensiveness. Only certainty. Gavin nodded. You should. Celeste looked at him. He continued. She recognizes you. She's comfortable with you. You looked for her. She's your foster to adopt placement. He glanced toward Pippa. Whatever this is with Marin, it doesn't change that. The sentence cost him less than he expected. Maybe because it was true. They had brought the same travel crate Pippa had used before. Celeste placed the familiar blanket inside. Pippa sniffed it. Then walked in. No resistance. No fear. Gavin watched Graham secure the crate in the SUV. Celeste thanked him twice. He told her once was enough. At the front door, Marin stood behind the glass. The SUV started. Inside the crate, Pippa turned toward the house. Her front paws came up against the crate door. Marin remained still on the other side of the glass. For several seconds, the distance between them was no more than the driveway. Then the vehicle backed out. Gavin stood beside the porch until it disappeared around the corner. Inside, the house was quieter. Not empty. Just returned to its previous size. On the kitchen counter, Gavin's laptop was still open to a pet supply page he had visited 2 nights earlier. A small identification tag sat in the shopping cart. The text field contained one word. Birdie. He stared at it. Then he closed the browser. He had never pressed purchase. Some part of him had known better. 2 evenings later, Celeste sent him a photograph. Pippa was asleep in her kitchen bed with one of Graham's socks beneath a paw. The caption read, She seems settled. Gavin showed it to Marin. Marin sniffed the phone and walked away. That night, at 1:54 a.m., the Bellamy's indoor camera recorded Pippa waking. She walked past her water bowl, past the kitchen table, straight to the back door. Then she sat. She did not scratch. She did not make a sound. For almost 10 minutes, the puppy simply stared through the dark glass. Then she returned to bed. For the first 2 days after Pippa returned to the Bellamy's, nothing looked wrong enough to justify worry. She ate every meal. She slept in the small bed beside the kitchen. She followed Celeste from room to room when Celeste folded laundry or carried dishes to the sink. She stole another one of Graham's socks and buried it beneath the blanket in her bed with the solemn concentration of someone completing important work. If Graham sat on the floor, Pippa climbed over his legs. If Celeste opened the refrigerator, Pippa appeared in the kitchen before the door was fully open. There was affection in all of it. That was what made the other behavior difficult to understand. At 1:54 on the second night, the indoor camera recorded Pippa waking. She walked directly to the back door. She sat. 9 minutes later, she returned to bed. The next night, it happened again. This time she remained there for 6 minutes. Celeste watched the recordings over breakfast. Graham stood behind her with a coffee mug in one hand. Maybe she hears something. Every night. Could be animals outside. Celeste replayed the clip. Pippa was not pacing. She was not barking. She simply faced the glass. Waiting seemed too human a word for it. and Celeste refused to use it. Still, she could not find a better one. During the day, another pattern appeared. Pippa began walking the fence line. Not frantically. She moved with her nose close to the ground, traveled from the back corner to the side gate, checked the lower boards, then returned to the patio. Graham inspected everything again. The gap beneath the fence had already been filled with compacted gravel and a buried barrier. He reinforced 2 other places simply because he disliked uncertainty. The old side gate bothered him more. Its metal latch had never aligned perfectly. You had to lift the gate slightly before the bolt seated completely. He added it to the weekend list. On Wednesday afternoon, a dog barked somewhere beyond the neighboring yards. Pippa ran to the fence. The bark came again. She stood with both ears forward, the right still tilted sideways. Then a collar tag jingled faintly beyond the houses. Pippa moved along the fence until the sound disappeared. That evening, Graham called Gavin. "She's fine," he said before Gavin could ask. Gavin stood at his kitchen counter, looking through the window at Marin resting beneath the maple. That's usually followed by something. She's eating, playing, sleeping. Celeste can't walk across the house without her following. Sounds terrible. I'm serious. So am I. Graham exhaled. She keeps checking the yard. Gavin was silent. Not trying to dig, Graham continued. Not exactly. She just keeps going back to the gate. Gavin looked at Marin. The old shepherd had her black rubber ball between her paws. We could let them see each other once. Graham hesitated. You think that's smart? No idea. That answer seemed to surprise him. Gavin continued. But right now we're all guessing. One controlled visit might tell us whether seeing Marin settles her or makes things worse. Celeste agreed. The following afternoon, Gavin drove Marin to the Bellamy's house. He had barely stopped the engine when barking came from inside. Not alarm barking. High, sharp bursts followed by the unmistakable sound of paws striking a floor. Gavin looked into the rearview mirror. Marin had already raised her head. Apparently you've been expected. Celeste opened the front door with Pippa on a leash. The puppy saw Marin through the open car door. For 1 second, she seemed unable to organize all 4 legs. Then she lunged forward, nearly wrapping the leash around Celeste's ankles. Easy, easy. Gavin let Marin out. Pippa reached her and circled twice. She pushed her nose beneath Marin's neck, emerged on the other side, ran 2 steps away, then came back again as if one greeting had been insufficient. Marin endured the first burst. When Pippa tried to climb under her chest a second time, Marin stepped sideways. Pippa adjusted immediately. That was new. They moved into the backyard. For nearly an hour, Pippa behaved like a different version of the dog Celeste had watched sitting silently at the kitchen door. She carried a braided rope across the grass and dropped it in front of Marin. Marin sniffed it. Pippa picked it up, moved 3 feet away, then returned and dropped it again. She hasn't touched that toy since she came back, Celeste said. Gavin watched Marin cross the yard. Pippa followed, but not with the rigid attention he remembered from the first week. She wandered away twice to investigate leaves, then hurried back when Marin changed direction. Eventually Marin lay beside the patio. Pippa circled once and settled nearby. Not beneath her. Not pressed against her. Just close. Within minutes, the puppy was asleep. Celeste looked at Graham. Neither said anything. That was the part Gavin carried with him, not the excitement. The sleep. Pippa had played all week at the Bellamy's house. She had eaten normally. She had accepted affection. But here, beside Marin, her whole body seemed to release something it had been quietly holding. Gavin checked his watch. We should go. Celeste nodded, though reluctantly. He clipped Marin's leash on. Pippa woke immediately. Marin walked toward the driveway. Pippa followed. Celeste gently shortened the puppy's leash. Pippa pulled once, then stopped. She watched Gavin open the rear door. Marin climbed inside. Pippa rose onto her hind legs and placed both front paws against the fence. Marin turned in the back seat. For several seconds, the 2 dogs looked at each other through the bars and glass. Then Gavin drove away. Pippa stayed at the fence until the car disappeared. That evening, Graham replaced one loose hinge. He meant to fix the gate latch too. Then the rain came. It rained through Thursday night and most of Friday morning, soaking the wooden gate until the frames swelled slightly. The old latch became harder to align. Graham tested it before work. It caught. At least he thought it did. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, but a wet wind moved through the yard. Celeste let Pippa outside after lunch. The puppy followed her usual route. Patio. Fence. Gate. Back corner. Then gate again. Celeste went inside to answer the phone. She was gone less than 2 minutes. When she returned, the yard was empty. At first she thought Pippa was behind the shed. Pippa. Nothing. She crossed the grass. The side gate stood open several inches. Celeste's stomach dropped. The latch rested against the metal plate instead of inside it. She ran through the opening. Pippa. No answer. She called Graham first, then Gavin. Gavin answered on the second ring. She's out. He was already reaching for his coat. When? Maybe 2 minutes. 3. Which direction? I don't know. Gavin looked toward Marin. The shepherd had stood up before he finished the call. Check the streets toward the green strip, he said. I'll take the other side. He reached for Marin's leash. She did not come. Instead, she walked toward the kitchen. Marin. She continued to the back door. Gavin followed. Marin stepped outside, crossed the porch, and moved several yards into the wet grass. She stopped, turned toward the fence, then returned to the porch. Gavin watched her. During their working years, Marin had taught him not to confuse stillness with uncertainty. Sometimes a dog stopped because the information was already there. Sometimes the handler was simply too slow to understand it. But this was not a search. Gavin knew that. Marin was not tracking. She was not casting for scent. She stood near the steps and looked toward the back corner of the yard, waiting. Gavin left her there and took the truck. The Bellamys searched the streets by car and on foot. Several neighbors joined. One woman remembered seeing a small muddy dog crossing behind 2 houses near the green strip. A man farther east thought he had seen something disappear between the trees. The distance was not impossible. From the Bellamy's backyard to Gavin's property, the direct route through the green corridor was just under a mile. For a puppy, it was still far enough. Especially as rain began again. Gavin drove the road twice. Nothing. Graham checked the green strip from the opposite end. Nothing. Celeste walked the surrounding blocks calling Pippa's name until her voice grew rough. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened early. Gavin returned home only to exchange his wet jacket for another. Marin had not moved far from the kitchen. He stood at the counter checking his phone. No new messages. No sightings. Then Marin lifted her head. Gavin heard nothing. A second passed. Then, scratch. He turned. Another pause. Scratch, scratch. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. Pippa stood outside. Mud covered her belly and legs. Her coat was dark with rain, and she was breathing fast from exertion. One front paw was lifted slightly from the porch boards. Jesus, kid. Gavin opened the door. Pippa ran past him. Marin stood in the middle of the kitchen. The puppy reached her and pushed her face beneath the old shepherd's neck. Gavin waited for Marin to step aside. She didn't. Instead, Marin lowered her head. Slowly, almost carefully, she licked the top of Pippa's wet head. Once. Pippa went still. Gavin had seen Marin tolerate her. Correct her. Wait for her. Give her a ball. This was different. This was the first time Marin had answered the puppy's need instead of merely allowing it. Gavin called Celeste. She's here. The sound Celeste made on the other end was half breath, half relief. Gavin carried Pippa into the utility room and checked the raised paw. One pad had been scraped during the trip, but the injury looked minor. He cleaned away the mud and wrapped the paw loosely until Laurel could look at it. Marin normally avoided the narrow utility room. This time she walked in without being called. She lay beside the towel. Pippa rested her chin over Marin's foreleg. 20 minutes later, the Bellamys arrived. Celeste entered first, rain still shining on her coat. She dropped beside Pippa. Pippa. The puppy lifted her head immediately. Her tail moved. She pushed her nose into Celeste's palm and licked her fingers. Graham stood behind her, soaked through the shoulders. He looked at Pippa, then at Marin, then at the wrapped paw. The old habit of solving things seemed to move across his face. Fence. Gate. Latch. Another repair. Then something in his expression changed. He removed his wet jacket. If we take her home tonight, he said quietly, how far does she run next time? Nobody answered. Celeste kept one hand against Pippa's cheek. Pippa leaned into it. The rest of her body remained against Marin. Gavin's phone rang. Tessa. He explained what had happened. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, nobody makes a permanent decision tonight. Gavin looked at the 3 people and 2 dogs crowded into the small room. What are you suggesting? Temporary foster placement with you. Written agreement. Short term. Graham looked toward the phone. And then, we get someone qualified to evaluate the behavior before anybody decides what home means for her. Outside, rain moved softly against the window. Inside, nobody reached for Pippa's leash. For the first time since she had returned, the question was no longer whether Pippa could find her way back to Marin. She already had. The question was what the people who loved her were going to do with that truth. Dr. Nora Kelsey arrived on a gray Tuesday morning and spent her first 20 minutes doing almost nothing. Gavin had expected questions. Instead, Nora sat sideways in one of the dining chairs with a teal notebook resting unopened on her knee. At 39, she had the quiet physical confidence of someone accustomed to being ignored by animals until they decided she mattered. Her dark curls were gathered in a low bun, and a small black training pouch sat at her waist, though she made no attempt to reach into it. Pippa investigated her shoes. Nora let her. Marin crossed the kitchen. Pippa followed. Nora watched. Gavin leaned against the counter. You're charging the rescue for this? Nora smiled without looking away from the dogs. For not interfering? Absolutely. Tessa had arranged the behavioral consultation as part of the temporary foster agreement. On paper, Pippa was still connected to the Bellamy's foster-to-adopt placement. For now, she was simply staying with Gavin while everyone tried to understand what had sent an 8-week-old puppy through rain and backyards to find one retired German Shepherd. Nora observed Pippa during breakfast, then in the yard. Then while Gavin moved from one room to another, she asked him to take Marin onto the porch for 30 seconds. Pippa immediately went to the door. She stood there, ears forward, but she did not scratch. When Marin returned, Pippa greeted her and then went back to chewing a corner of the braided rope. Nora finally opened the notebook. That's different from what you described last week. It is. How long has she been doing better? Depends what better means. Fair. Gavin poured coffee. What do you think is happening? Nora closed the notebook again. First, I don't know what she's thinking. Good start. I'm serious. People like stories with neat labels. She lost her mother. Therefore, Marin became her replacement mother. It sounds satisfying. It may also be wrong. Gavin nodded. Nora watched Pippa settle within sight of Marin. What we can say is that she lost a major source of physical and social security very early. Foster notes show she repeatedly sought contact with adult dogs or littermates before she could settle. Now she uses Marin in a similar way. Attachment. Probably. A very strong one. Bad. Not automatically. Nora leaned forward slightly. The mistake would be deciding she has to stop needing Marin. Gavin looked at her. The goal isn't separation, Nora said. The goal is flexibility. She pointed toward the living room. Pippa needs to learn that safety doesn't disappear just because Marin leaves the room. That can mean trusting the house. Trusting you. Trusting Celeste and Graham. Trusting routines. Eventually, even trusting herself enough to wait. Gavin glanced toward Pippa. The puppy was asleep with one paw resting on the braided rope. Marin lay several feet away. So we widen the world. Exactly. They started small. Marin went outside with Gavin, while Pippa remained indoors with Nora for less than a minute. Then 2. Pippa watched the door, but accepted a toy. Another day, Gavin stayed inside with Pippa while Marin rested in the bedroom. Pippa checked the hallway twice, then returned to Gavin's chair. Nothing about the work looked dramatic. That was the point. The Bellamys continued visiting. Celeste came first on Thursday afternoon with no crate and no expectation of taking Pippa anywhere. The puppy ran to her before the door fully opened. Celeste laughed as Pippa climbed against her knees. "You haven't forgotten me." Pippa immediately tried to steal one of her gloves. Apparently not. Graham came after work the following Saturday. He brought the braided rope Pippa had left at their house. She recognized it and challenged him to a brief tug game before carrying it across the room to Gavin. Graham noticed. He did not comment. When the Bellamys left, Pippa followed them into the hallway. She watched the door close. For several seconds, Gavin waited for the old reaction. It did not come. Pippa turned. She checked the living room, found Marin near the window, then wandered to Gavin and dropped the rope against his boot. It was a tiny change, so small that nobody celebrated it. But Gavin remembered 3 nights on the porch. He remembered a puppy who would accept cold before losing sight of one particular dog. This puppy had watched 2 people she loved leave the house and had remained inside. The world had not ended. 2 mornings later, Marin had trouble standing. Gavin noticed before she did. The old shepherd pushed herself up from the rug, placed weight on the left rear leg, then shifted off it again. She took 1 step. Stopped. Gavin's expression tightened. The stiffness had been present for years, a reminder of an old working injury that usually faded after a few minutes of movement. This time it didn't. Marin. She looked at him. Gavin crouched and ran his hand carefully along the leg. No obvious new injury. No sudden event he could identify. But she was protecting the joint. He called Laurel. By noon, Marin was back at the clinic. Laurel reviewed the imaging beside Gavin while Marin rested in an examination area. "The old joint changes have progressed," she said. "Cold weather probably isn't helping." "How bad?" "Manageable." Gavin studied her face. "You said that too quickly." Laurel ignored him. "I want to treat the inflammation, adjust her medication, and keep her here tonight so I can see how she responds before she goes home." Gavin looked through the small window in the door. Marin was lying on a blanket, alert but calm. 1 night. It should not have felt significant. Then he remembered who was waiting at home. When he pulled into the driveway alone, Pippa was already at the front window. Her tail moved when she saw Gavin, then stopped. He opened the door. Pippa ran outside before he could remove his coat. She reached the truck. Looked through the open rear door. Nothing. She circled the vehicle once, then ran inside. Gavin followed. Pippa checked Marin's usual place beside the kitchen, the living room rug, the hallway, the back door, then the bedroom. Gavin did not call her away. Nora had been clear about that too. Allow the search. Allow the uncertainty. Do not turn every uncomfortable emotion into an emergency. Eventually, Pippa returned to the kitchen. She lay facing the back door. Gavin placed one of Marin's old towels beside her bed. The puppy sniffed it, then picked it up and carried it to the door. She curled across it. Gavin made dinner. Pippa stayed there. At 10, she was still there. By midnight, Gavin had moved into the living room with a book he had read 3 pages of in nearly an hour. The house sounded wrong without Marin. He had lived alone before her. He could barely remember what that silence had felt like. Now every familiar noise seemed to end too early. No collar tag in the hallway. No deliberate steps between rooms. No exhale from the rug beside the couch. Gavin looked toward the kitchen. Pippa remained by the door. He wondered if Nora's theory about widening the world had limits. Maybe some absences were simply too large. At 12:47, fabric scraped softly across the floor. Gavin looked up. Pippa was moving through the hallway backward. Marin's towel was clamped in her mouth. She dragged it several feet, stopped to reposition it, then pulled again. Gavin expected her to carry it toward Marin's usual sleeping place. She didn't. Pippa came into the living room. She stopped beside Gavin's chair, dropped the towel, turned twice. then lay across one edge of it with her back pressed firmly against Gavin's boot. He did not move. For a long moment, neither did she. Then her breathing gradually slowed. Gavin lowered one hand toward her, stopped before touching. Pippa shifted slightly until more of her body rested against his foot. Only then did he place his palm gently along her shoulder. She stayed. Something about the moment hurt more than the earlier desperation had. Not because she had forgotten Maren. The towel beneath her made that impossible to pretend. She still needed the scent. Still missed the dog. But when Maren was unavailable, Pippa had found another place to settle. Gavin sat there until the book slid closed in his lap. The next morning Laurel called. Maren's doing well. Gavin looked down. Pippa was asleep on the towel near his chair. When can I bring her home? This afternoon. But we're changing the rules. The rules arrived in the form of a low indoor gate. For the next several days, Maren needed rest and controlled movement. No sudden turns. No bouncing puppy against her legs. No wrestling. No chasing. No attempts to crawl beneath her. Gavin divided part of the living room so Maren could recover without being isolated. When she came home, Pippa heard the truck. She was waiting at the door. Maren entered slowly. Pippa rushed forward. Gavin caught her gently around the chest before she reached the older dog. Not this time. Pippa struggled once from confusion. Then she saw the gate. Maren settled on the blanket behind it. Pippa moved along the barrier. One end. The other. Back again. She pushed her nose between the bars. Maren watched. Pippa paced for several minutes. Then something changed. Maren lowered her head onto her paws. Pippa stopped walking. She stood opposite her. The gate separated them by less than 4 feet. Eventually Pippa lay down. For the first time, she accepted distance even though the dog she wanted was directly in front of her. The following days became slower. Maren rested. Pippa learned to wait. Sometimes she slept beside the gate. Sometimes she wandered away. Once Gavin found her alone beneath the dining table, chewing his left slipper. Excellent recovery plan. Pippa continued chewing. For days later, she discovered the braided rope. She carried it to the gate and dropped it in front of Maren. Maren lifted her head. Pippa waited. Nothing happened. The older dog remained on the blanket. Pippa picked the rope up. Dropped it again. Still nothing. Gavin watched from his chair. Pippa stood there for several seconds. The old version of her might have remained beside the gate indefinitely. Instead, she turned, walked across the room, and placed the other end of the rope against Gavin's shoe. He looked down. Pippa backed away. The invitation was unmistakable. Gavin picked up the rope. All right. Pippa pulled. Her front paws slid across the floor. Gavin let her win enough to make the game interesting. Behind the gate, Maren watched them. Pippa did not check. Not once. A little over 2 weeks later, Laurel cleared Maren for gradually increased movement. Gavin folded the gate against the wall. Pippa stood several feet away. Maren rose from the blanket. Pippa moved. 1 step. 2. 3. Then she stopped. Her tail moved rapidly, but her body remained where it was. Maren looked at her. The old shepherd walked the remaining distance herself. Their noses touched. Pippa did not push beneath Maren's chest. She did not climb against her. Maren turned toward the kitchen. Pippa fell into step beside her. Not underneath. Not behind. Beside. Gavin remained near the folded gate. For weeks, he had thought progress would mean Pippa needing Maren less. Watching them walk away together, he understood it differently. Pippa had not learned to love Maren less. She had learned that love could survive a little space. By the time Maren could cross the backyard without Gavin watching every step, Pippa had stopped treating every separation like an emergency. The change was easiest to see in ordinary moments. Maren would leave the living room for water, and Pippa might notice without following. Gavin could take the older shepherd onto the porch while Pippa remained inside, chewing the braided rope. Some afternoons, Maren slept near the kitchen while Pippa stretched beneath Gavin's chair, not touching either of them. Nothing dramatic had replaced the old anxiety. That was what made the progress feel real. Pippa had simply begun spending less of her life checking whether someone was about to disappear. One Saturday morning, Gavin opened the back door to let Maren outside. Pippa was occupied with a cardboard tube he had given her to investigate. Maren stepped onto the porch. Pippa looked up. Gavin watched from the counter. For several seconds, the puppy's eyes remained on the doorway. Then she lowered her head and returned to the cardboard. Gavin smiled. A month earlier, he would have considered that impossible. Now it raised an uncomfortable question. If Pippa could tolerate Maren leaving, if she could sleep alone, play with Gavin, and find comfort in more than one place, then why shouldn't she return to the Bellamys? He did not like how quickly the question had appeared. He liked even less that he did not have an answer. Nora came by that afternoon for another observation session. She watched Pippa play by herself in the yard while Maren rested beneath the maple tree. She's doing well, Gavin said. She is. So. Nora looked at him. So what? Gavin crossed his arms. You know what I'm asking. I know what you want me to answer. Not the same thing. Usually not. She closed the teal notebook. Gavin, improvement doesn't tell us where she should live. It only tells us she's improving. He glanced toward Pippa. The puppy had found a dry leaf and was carrying it around as if she had discovered a valuable object. Nora continued. There are two bad ways to think about this. I'm listening. One is that because she ran back to Maren, she must belong here. Gavin nodded. The other is that because she's less dependent on Maren now, the problem is fixed and she should automatically go back. And both are wrong. Both are too simple. Nora looked toward Maren. Pippa built stability here. Maren may have been the first anchor, but she isn't the only one anymore. There's you, this house, the routines, the yard, even the stupid slipper she keeps stealing. Left slipper. Important distinction. Gavin almost smiled. Nora went on. The Bellamys are also part of her safe social world. She remembers them. She enjoys them. That's not in question. So we're back where we started. No. Nora shook her head. When this began, everybody was asking which person or dog Pippa wanted most. That's the wrong question. What is the right one? If both homes could care for her, what benefit would another transition give her now? Gavin did not answer. Nora did not answer for him. That became the question everyone carried through the next 2 weeks. The Bellamys began taking Pippa on short outings without Gavin or Maren. The first was a 20-minute walk around the neighborhood. Celeste arrived with the soft teal leash Pippa had used before she disappeared. Pippa recognized it. She pushed her nose toward the clip while Celeste laughed. Apparently this part wasn't traumatic. Gavin opened the gate. Pippa left willingly. She did not look back until they reached the sidewalk. Then she glanced toward the yard once and kept walking. Gavin stood beside Maren and watched them turn the corner. 23 minutes later, Pippa came back with a maple leaf stuck to one leg and Celeste smiling. No trouble. Pippa greeted Maren. Then Gavin. Then ran to the water bowl. No panic. No frantic reunion. Just return. A few days later, Graham took her alone. He arrived straight from work in his forest green jacket, an old metal tape measure still hooked at his pocket. Pippa ran to him with the braided rope. You remember who's useful, Graham said. They played for a minute before he clipped on the leash. He took her along the walking path near the small lake. When they returned, Pippa jumped against his leg once before Gavin reminded her to keep forepaws down. Graham rubbed her shoulders. You could come home with us tomorrow and probably be okay. It was not a question. Gavin looked at him. Probably. Graham's jaw tightened slightly. That word was becoming the problem. Probably. They could rebuild the routine. Probably. They could prevent another escape. Probably. Pippa might settle. Probably. Nobody could promise more than that. The next visit lasted most of an afternoon. Celeste sat on the rug while Pippa slept with her head across the woman's ankle. Maren was in the kitchen. Gavin noticed the distance. So did Celeste. She looked down at Pippa. She used to sleep like she had to be touching somebody. Most of the time. And now. Sometimes she sleeps in the hallway just because that's where she stopped. Celeste smiled. Then the smile faded. I should be happy about that. You are. I am. Her fingers moved slowly over Pippa's ear. That's what makes this hard. Gavin understood. If Pippa had rejected them, the decision would have been painful but simple. If she had feared them, there would have been no decision at all. But Pippa loved them. That remained obvious. When Celeste arrived, Pippa brought toys. When Graham sat down, she climbed against his legs. She knew their voices. She knew the old leash. She remembered which jacket pocket Graham sometimes kept treats in. Nothing had been erased. That afternoon, Celeste stood to leave. Pippa followed her to the hallway. Celeste put on her coat. Pippa sat. The front door opened. Cold air moved inside. Celeste stepped onto the porch. Pippa remained where she was. She watched. Celeste looked back. For a moment, neither moved. Then Pippa turned away from the door. She crossed the living room, passed Marin without stopping, and walked directly to Gavin. She sat beside his boot. Celeste saw it. Gavin wished she hadn't. Not because Pippa had chosen him. That was not what had happened. But because Celeste understood what the moment meant. Pippa could love someone leaving. And stay. Celeste closed the door gently behind her. The next week, Graham invited Gavin to the Bellamy house. Pippa came too. It was the first time she had been back since the day she escaped. Graham had changed almost everything about the backyard perimeter. The loose section beneath the fence was reinforced. The old gate latch was gone. A new self-closing mechanism sat higher on the frame. Graham demonstrated it once. The gate clicked firmly into place. That isn't opening accidentally again. Gavin inspected it. No. I went 6 inches down with the barrier around the fence. I can see that. And I replaced the lower boards along the back. Gavin looked over the yard. You've been busy. Graham gave a humorless laugh. I know how to fix this kind of problem. Pippa was walking beside Celeste near the patio. She sniffed the place where her old bed had once been moved outside to dry. Then she continued toward the grass. Graham rested both hands on the gate. I kept thinking if I fixed everything she used to get out, then we'd have an answer. Gavin waited. But every time I repaired something, I found myself wondering what I'd repair next. You don't know that she'd run again. No. Graham looked toward Pippa. That's almost worse. They went inside. Pippa remembered the kitchen immediately. She checked the corner where her bed had been. Celeste brought it from a closet. Pippa sniffed it, stepped into it, turned once, then stepped back out. Nothing was wrong. Nothing frightened her. She simply crossed the room and lay beneath the kitchen table instead. Celeste stared at the empty bed. There was no rejection in the gesture, just change. Later, Nora joined them for coffee. She did not perform another test. No closed doors. No calling Pippa from opposite sides of the room. Instead, she made something clear that all 4 adults needed to hear. Please don't turn this into a choice between people. Celeste nodded slowly. Nora continued. If we put Gavin on one side and you on the other and see where Pippa walks, we learn almost nothing useful. Because she might choose whoever has food, Graham said. Or whoever moved last. Or whichever side she's already facing. A faint smile crossed his face. Nora looked between them. Pippa does not need to prove love by choosing one household over another. The room went quiet. Gavin looked at the coffee in front of him. If Celeste and Graham want to continue the adoption, he said, I'll help. Celeste turned toward him. I mean it. We can transition slowly. Short visits. Afternoons here. Then evenings. Whatever Nora thinks makes sense. He paused. I'm not going to argue that she belongs to me because she showed up at my door. The words felt important to say aloud. Graham looked at him for a long time. I believe you. Pippa wandered into the kitchen carrying the braided rope. She dropped it near Graham. He picked up one end. They played. She pulled hard enough to slide across the floor, recovered, then came back again. Celeste laughed. For a few minutes, nobody discussed adoption. They simply watched a puppy enjoying herself in a house where she had once been loved and still was. When the game ended, Pippa crossed to Celeste and rested her chin on her knee. Celeste stroked the golden fur between her ears. Her eyes stayed on Pippa. She doesn't have to live here to prove she remembers us, does she? Nobody answered immediately. Nora finally said, "No." Celeste's hand remained on Pippa's head. "That's harder than I thought it would be." Graham looked toward the backyard. The new gate was visible through the glass. He had rebuilt it better than before. Stronger hinges. New latch. Buried barrier. Everything that could physically keep a puppy inside had been addressed. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I can build a fence high enough to keep her in." Celeste looked at him. Graham's voice remained steady. "But I don't want our love to become something she has to spend her life trying to escape." Gavin said nothing. There was nothing useful to add. The statement did not settle the decision, but it changed the shape of it. They agreed not to decide that afternoon. No one wanted exhaustion, guilt, or one emotional moment to determine the rest of Pippa's life. They would meet again at Gavin's house that weekend. Tessa would have the necessary paperwork available either way. If the Bellamys wanted to continue the foster-to-adopt process, they would build a gradual transition plan. If they chose otherwise, the rescue could begin the transfer correctly. No improvising. No winner. No loser. Just a decision they would all have to live with. That evening, Celeste opened the small drawer beside her kitchen counter. Inside lay a tiny identification tag. She had bought it before Pippa disappeared. The puppy's name was engraved across the front. On the back were the Bellamy's phone number and address. Celeste lifted it into her palm. For weeks, she had kept it because attaching it had once represented the beginning of Pippa's life with them. Now she slipped it carefully into the pocket of her coat. On Saturday, she would take it with her. She still did not know whether she was bringing it to put on Pippa's collar or to say goodbye. Saturday arrived without snow, rain, or anything else dramatic enough to announce that a family was about to change. The afternoon was pale and cold, the last traces of winter lingering in shaded corners of Gavin's yard. Marin slept near the kitchen doorway while Pippa worked patiently at one frayed end of the braided rope. Gavin had cleaned the house that morning for no good reason. The Bellamys had been there many times. They knew where the coffee mugs were. Graham had repaired a loose porch hinge during one visit without being asked. Celeste had once folded a blanket she found on the sofa as naturally as if she had lived there. Still, Gavin had wiped down the kitchen counters twice. He understood why. There were decisions that changed your life loudly. Others arrived in an ordinary vehicle on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. At 2:17, Marin lifted her head. A few seconds later, tires rolled across the gravel. Pippa heard them. She dropped the rope and ran toward the front window. Gavin stayed where he was. The dark SUV stopped beside the driveway. Graham got out first. Celeste came around the passenger side. Gavin noticed something before either of them reached the porch. There was no travel crate in the back. His stomach tightened. That meant something. He refused to decide what. Pippa was already waiting at the door, tail sweeping against the wall. Gavin opened it. Celeste barely managed to step inside before Pippa reached her. The puppy pressed against her legs, circled once, then rose halfway before remembering enough manners to keep her front paws down. Celeste laughed and dropped to her knees anyway. "There you are." Pippa buried her face beneath Celeste's arm. Celeste held her. Not tightly. Just long enough that Gavin looked away for a moment. Graham entered carrying nothing but his jacket and the expression of a man who had spent too much of the week thinking. Pippa spotted him next. She disappeared into the living room, returned with the braided rope, and dropped it beside his boot. Graham looked down. Of course. He picked up one end. Pippa pulled. The game lasted less than a minute. Graham let her win, though Gavin suspected Pippa believed otherwise. When it ended, she carried the rope toward the rug and settled with it between her paws. Marin remained near the kitchen. No one called Pippa toward either dog or person. Nobody stood on opposite sides of the room. No one asked her to choose. They had learned enough to understand how little such a choice would mean. Gavin made coffee. For several minutes, they spoke about ordinary things. Marin's leg. The road crews filling winter potholes. A leak Graham had finally fixed at the paper facility. Pippa wandered between them without urgency. She rested beside Celeste for a while, then near Gavin's chair, then carried the rope toward Marin, thought better of waking her and abandoned it halfway across the room. It was almost peaceful. That made what followed harder. Graham set his coffee down. Celeste reached into the pocket of her slate blue coat. Her hand remained there for a second. Then she placed something on the table. A small metal identification tag. Gavin recognized Pippa's name before he saw anything else. Pippa. Simple block letters across the front. Celeste turned it over. Their phone number. Their address. The home they had prepared before she ever disappeared beneath the fence. We bought it the week before she came to us, Celeste said. Gavin touched neither the tag nor his coffee. We were going to put it on after we were sure the collar fit. Graham looked toward Pippa. Then we never got the chance. The room became very quiet. Gavin understood before they said it. Still, he waited. Celeste drew a slow breath. We talked to Tessa yesterday. Gavin nodded. And Nora? Another nod. We want to transfer the placement. Pippa was chewing the rope. She had no idea that 3 adults had just changed the address that would one day be written beside her name. Gavin looked at Celeste. You don't owe me this. I know. You don't owe me anything because I found her. I know. If this is gratitude, it isn't. Celeste's answer came gently, but immediately. Gavin stopped. Graham leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. We know she could probably come back with us. That word again. Probably. We could do the transition, Graham continued. Slowly, carefully. We could make the yard safer than it already is. Gavin said nothing. Graham looked toward Marin. But being able to make something work isn't the same as having a reason to make it happen. Celeste's eyes had filled, though her voice remained steady. She's stable here. Pippa lifted her head at the sound of Celeste's voice. Celeste smiled at her. Look at her. Pippa returned to the rope. She can let Marin leave the room. She can stay with you. She can come with us and enjoy herself. She isn't holding on to everybody like they're about to disappear. Gavin looked down at the tag. You helped her get there too. Celeste nodded. Maybe. No, maybe. Her mouth tightened. For a moment, she could not answer. Then she pushed the tag across the table. Gavin finally picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. Yet the small piece of metal felt strangely heavy in his palm. Celeste looked at it. When she gets older. She stopped. Graham lowered his eyes. Celeste tried again. When she gets older, don't let her forget there were 2 people who really wanted to bring her home. Gavin closed his fingers around the tag. She won't. It was the only promise he trusted himself to make. Nobody celebrated. There was paperwork to complete later with Tessa, veterinary registration to update, a new identification tag to order. Those things could wait. For now, Celeste moved to the rug. She sat beside Pippa and stroked the fur between her ears. Pippa rolled partly onto her side. You made this difficult, Celeste whispered. Pippa tried to chew the sleeve of her coat. Celeste laughed through the tears she had finally stopped hiding. Yes, that seems about right. Graham crouched beside them. He rubbed Pippa's shoulders with both hands. Then he stood before he was ready. Gavin knew because he recognized the movement. Sometimes leaving became harder if you allowed yourself one more minute. Celeste rose. They put on their coats. Pippa followed. At the front door, she waited while Gavin opened it. The Bellamys stepped onto the porch. Pippa went with them. Gavin did not stop her. She followed them down the steps, across the yard, all the way to the gate. Marin remained on the porch. The old shepherd did not call her back. Neither did Gavin. Graham opened the passenger door for Celeste. She paused, then turned and crouched once more. Pippa approached. Celeste took the puppy's face gently between both hands. She pressed her forehead against the small sable head. No words came. None were needed. When she stood, Pippa remained beside the gate. Celeste got into the SUV and closed the door. Graham walked around to the driver's side. He stopped beside Pippa. You stay out of trouble. Pippa's tail moved. Graham looked toward Gavin. A small nod passed between them. Then he got in. The engine started. Pippa stood at the fence. Inside the passenger seat, Celeste turned toward the side window. Gavin could see one hand raised to her face. Graham placed both hands on the steering wheel. The vehicle did not move. 5 seconds. Maybe 10. Then it rolled slowly backward. Pippa followed along the fence. At the end of the driveway, the SUV stopped again before turning onto the road. For one impossible moment, Gavin wondered whether the door would open. It didn't. The SUV turned. Pippa stood perfectly still. The vehicle grew smaller, then disappeared beyond the trees. Silence settled over the yard. Pippa kept looking. Gavin stayed near the porch. Every instinct urged him to say her name. He didn't. This had to belong to her. Marin stood several yards behind him. The old shepherd waited too. At last, Pippa lowered her head. She turned. First she looked toward Gavin. Then Marin. Nobody moved toward her. Pippa began walking. Not running. Not panicked. Walking. She crossed the yard at an easy pace, passed through the open gate, and climbed the porch steps. For a second, she stopped beside Gavin. Then she touched her nose lightly to his hand. After that she went to Marin. Their noses met. Pippa did not crawl beneath her chest. Marin turned toward the house. Pippa followed beside her. Gavin looked once toward the empty road. Then he closed the gate. Not to keep Pippa in. Only because evening was coming. By spring, Pippa's legs no longer looked too large for the rest of her. The right ear had finally risen most of the way, though the tip still leaned outward enough to preserve something of the puppy she had been. The Bellamys kept visiting. Their SUV remained one of the few vehicles Pippa could identify before it reached the driveway. When Celeste arrived, Pippa ran to her. When Graham came through the gate, she usually searched for something he could throw or pull. They stayed for coffee. Sometimes dinner. Once Graham repaired the kitchen cabinet Gavin had been ignoring for 6 months. When they left, Pippa still walked them to the gate. She watched the SUV disappear. Then Gavin called. Once. Pippa. She turned and came home. The old identification tag remained in the drawer beside the back door. Gavin had ordered another after the paperwork became official. The new one carried his address and number. He never threw the old one away. He could not bring himself to treat one address as though it erased the other. One mild afternoon, Gavin was folding clean towels at the kitchen counter. The back door stood open. Marin rose from the living room rug. Her leg was better, though age still shaped the first few steps after a long nap. She crossed the kitchen, then went outside. Pippa lay several feet away with the braided rope between her paws. Her head came up. She looked toward the door. Months earlier, that single movement would have been enough. She would have abandoned the toy, crossed the room, followed. Now she watched Marin step onto the porch and continue into the yard. The door stayed open. There was no gate across the living room, no barrier between them. Nothing stopped Pippa from running after her. Pippa lowered her head. She returned to the rope. Gavin stopped folding the towel. He watched her. Outside, Marin moved slowly beneath the maple tree. She sniffed the damp spring grass. Pippa stayed where she was. A few minutes later, Marin returned. Pippa stood. She walked over and touched her nose to Marin's muzzle. Then she turned back toward the rope. Marin continued 3 steps. Stopped. The old black rubber ball lay near the wall. She picked it up, carried it back, and dropped it directly in front of Pippa. Pippa stared at the ball, then at Marin. Her tail began moving. Marin turned toward the open door. This time, Pippa picked up the ball and followed. Not because Marin had disappeared, not because she was afraid of being left behind, because she wanted to go. Gavin stood alone in the kitchen and watched the 2 shepherds cross the yard together. Beside him was the drawer containing the old tag. Outside was a dog wearing the new one. Pippa had never belonged to a family that loved her and another that gave her away. She had belonged to 2 families brave enough to love her differently. One had been ready to keep her. The other had learned that sometimes keeping someone was not the kindest proof of love. And Marin had given Pippa something none of them had known how to teach at first. A door could close. Someone could leave. Someone could even disappear from sight. And love could still be there when the door opened again. 3 cold nights ago, what now felt like another lifetime. Pippa had slept on the outside of that doorway because Marin was inside. Now the same doorway stood wide open. Marin could leave. Pippa could stay. Neither possibility frightened her anymore. Gavin watched Pippa carry the old ball into the spring sunlight beside Marin. Then he looked at the open door. For the first time since the little dog had arrived, there was nothing on either side of it waiting in fear. Sometimes love is not proven by how tightly we hold on, but by whether we are willing to choose what is best for someone we care about. Pippa was loved in 2 different homes, and no one had to become the villain for her to find where she could finally feel secure. One family gave her stability. Another loved her enough to step aside. And through Marin, she learned that someone can walk away for a while without disappearing from your heart. In our own lives, the hardest choices are often the ones where love asks us to release control. We may not always get to keep the people, places, or seasons that matter to us in the way we hoped. But sometimes grace is found in trusting that love can remain, even when its form changes. If this story touched you, tell us what you believe the Bellamy's decision meant for Pippa. Share your thoughts in the comments. And subscribe if you would like to hear more stories about loyalty, compassion, and the difficult choices that reveal what love truly means. May you have the wisdom to know when to hold on, the courage to know when to let go, and peace with whatever love leaves behind.